In 1975, Parliament released the album Mothership Connection, an album that would cement the group in the history books, inspiring generations of musicians for decades. It's somehow simultaneously timeless, but also very of its time. Today, we're diving into this album, the story, the sounds, the stems, the influence, and also the time it came out of, and seeing how Parliament went on to be one of the most important bands in music history. So put a glide in your stride and a dip in your hip, and come on up to the Mothership. Welcome back to Camp Digs, the summer camp where we dive into 6 classic albums in 6 weeks. If you're watching this and you're not signed up, you gotta sign up before camp ends. Each week, I send out listening notes, an extended playlist. We're all chatting about the album of the week, and then we end the week with a campfire live stream with food and drink pairing. We started with 90s week with a Tribe album, then it was 80s week with a Beastie Boys album, 2000s week with Danger Mouse's Grey album, and this week is Funk Week. Sign up for free at patreon.com/diggingthegreats. Everything is completely free, and the paid tiers get the extended edits of the videos ad-free with much more music and commentary. Again, patreon.com/diggingthegreats. So, throughout the past few weeks, we've moved through different decades, and we can see, even just in the few albums we've covered, how music grows and changes. How it's influenced by other music that came before it. There's nothing brand new under the sun, right? Everything is influenced by something, whether directly as things become more popular or as a reaction against that thing. But as we're diving through Funk Week with Parliament's Mothership Connection, we have to talk about some of these influences, because it's not just about the sound, like the instruments, the tone, the rhythms. It's about the entire concept being influenced by everything around it. Honestly, it feels like Mothership Connection, for as out there and funky and influential as it is, it feels like it was inevitable. Like, of course, if you put these musicians in this situation, this is what comes out. But before we talk about Mothership Connection specifically, let's talk about Motown. Sorry, I felt a tremor. I thought Trey was gonna... No? The leader of Parliament and Funkadelic, and Parliament Funkadelic, and the P-Funk All-Stars, and the entire operation is George Clinton. He's a little like if you took Berry Gordy and James Brown and rolled them into one, and then smoked it. I think I did it. Let's pack it up. That's my best analogy ever. Speaking of smoking, let's start by talking about not Parliament, but the Parliaments. George Clinton got his start in the late 50s with his doo-wop group, the Parliaments. Yes, they named themselves after the cigarette brand. But throughout the late 50s and early 60s, the Parliaments, a group of 5 male singers, recorded albums and performed live, but they struggled to break out of their home area of New Jersey. Let's take a listen to the song that was their first minor hit, I Wanna Testify. Yeah, I mean, there's basically nothing wrong with that. It sounds very of the time. It sounds, honestly, very Motown. Remember how I said George Clinton was like Berry Gordy and James Brown rolled into one and then smoked? Well, the Parliaments actually auditioned for Motown. You know Motown, the Detroit-based hit factory run by Berry Gordy, which was a giant collective of musicians, artists, and songwriters. Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, Jackson 5, Gladys Knight, The Temptations. Motown was like a shining light, an organization made up of almost entirely black people in the 1960s, not just making music, but making big hits and making big money. But when George Clinton and the Parliaments arrived in Detroit to audition for Motown, it didn't go as planned. Detroit was the best place in the world to be. If you were looking for your heroes, they was all within that one block. They was just becoming famous themselves. So we caught them right at that time, and after we auditioned, they told us we were all right. We wasn't 6 feet tall, that was the criteria. The Temptations was all 6 feet. They was wanting to judge everybody by the Temptations standard at that time because they were so cool. We looked like a ladder. It just wasn't the same kind of cool, and we didn't look like we could be what they call charm schooled. Motown, for all its success, worked partially because it presented its artists in a very clean and charming way. Some might say it was a little too polished, a little too I don't know, I guess just like they're not trying to ruffle white people's feathers, you know what I mean? It is the 1960s after all. And while the Parliaments didn't sign with Motown, George Clinton did end up briefly working as a songwriter for Motown, so he got even closer to the Motown machine. He continued the band, moving the entire operation to Detroit, but let's talk about that reactionary influence. George Clinton was being influenced by Motown in a completely different way. Instead of following the Motown sound, staying doo-wop, he wanted to take the Parliaments in a completely different direction. There was just one problem. He lost the name rights for the band The Parliaments, so he formed a new group. He used the same original 5 singers from the Parliaments, but brought the backing band forward. This new band would be billed as just the instrumentalists, with the Parliament singers listed on the album as guests. This new album, this new project, it was called Funkadelic. So yes, before we talk about Parliament's Mothership Connection, we have to briefly talk about Funkadelic. This group was born directly out of the Parliaments, but instead of going the doo-wop route, it's much more funk-influenced and much more psychedelic rock-influenced. And now, we're in 1970. A lot has happened in America. Woodstock was in 1969. Jimi Hendrix has been huge. James Brown has exploded, and all of these influences can be clearly heard in Funkadelic. So let's take a listen to the song Hit It and Quit It from the 1971 Funkadelic album, Maggot Brain. This album is a classic in its own right, and I know it's crazy that we're glossing over it right now. I know. It needs to be its own video, but we gotta keep making our way towards the mothership. But what I hear in that is Jimi Hendrix influence, very late 60s psychedelic rock influence, mixed with funk, yes, but very different from where they'd go with Mothership Connection. There are a few steps in between. Steps like, well, George Clinton did get the name rights back for the Parliaments, opting to start a new group simply called Parliament. This group would be comprised of many of the same musicians as Funkadelic, which was also made up of the same 5 singers from the Parliaments. But following the Motown model, George Clinton began to expand his musical empire, growing his pool of musicians, but pulling from that same pool for new projects. As Parliament started, they sounded very similar to Funkadelic. It's more funk-driven, a little less guitar-driven, but I mean, there's a lot of the same people, and you can hear that in the sound. Here's the song Up for the Downstroke from 1974. Now we're in heavy funk. There's an obvious James Brown influence, not only because James Brown was huge and his music is amazing, but because the legendary Bootsy Collins is on bass, who also played with James Brown. But Parliament keeps going, keeps pushing. Early in 1975, they released the album Chocolate City, which is a sort of tribute to Washington, D.C. and the black population there. And it imagines something never before seen. A black president.
They still call it the White House, but that's a temporary condition too. Can you dig it, CC?
You hear those synths in there? That's another instrument that's growing in popularity throughout the 70s. They're starting to incorporate that as well. And for the time, you gotta understand what a wild idea this was. It's 1975. The current president is Gerald Ford, who only became president after Nixon resigned because of Watergate. And this is shortly after the disaster of the Vietnam War, which ended in 1973, after the Civil Rights Movement all through the 60s, after Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, Malcolm X in 1965, the space race with Russia is happening, the hippie idealism of the 60s. All of this has happened in the years since George Clinton started his doo-wop group. So after Chocolate City comes out, the same year, 1975, Parliament releases Mothership Connection, an album which, well, here's George Clinton's own words about it. My dream up until then had always been to be able to make a funk opera. Chocolate City imagined blacks in the White House, and that had worked because of what was happening at that moment. So I said, where's the next place you don't see us at? And that was basically outer space. The only one of us you saw was Uhura in Star Trek. Otherwise, we weren't in outer space, so the Mothership Connection was that funk opera, and while making it, we weren't tied down to this planet for a minute. Mothership Connection is a crucial piece of musical history, and an important part of an aesthetic that would become known as Afrofuturism, which imagines people of the African diaspora through the lens of technology, the future, and science fiction. A great recent example of Afrofuturism is the movie Black Panther, in which Wakanda is a thriving African nation, wealthy and technologically advanced, and untouched by most of the rest of the continent's history. So Mothership Connection is all about getting off Earth, away from the problems of Earth, and getting into the funk. And man, is it funky. If you're in Camp Diggs, you've been listening to this album and a lot of Parliament and Funkadelic all throughout this week. So you know this album well, but I want to take a moment and specifically dive into the multi-tracks for the second song on the album, Mothership Connection, Starchild. Alright, we're going to start this track from the beginning with just the drums. Drums and the claps, which also have, let's solo that. Bunch of just sort of party noise in there, right? Time for some bass. That bass, man, that's Bootsy. So funky. That's also the filter effect he's got on there. Crazy funky, man. Let's add some guitar with that. Listen to the synth we have on top of all of this, though. A little later. Let's listen to these horns. This is Fred Wesley and Maceo Parker, who also are from James Brown's band. We got a lot of James Brown influence in here. Just listen to how tight and funky these horns are. Come on, man. What's going on with the background vocals?
If you hear any noise, it's just me and the boys hitting me.
One of my favorite fun things about this is the line, if you hear any noise, it's just me and the boys. Then on Ladies Night by Kool and the Gang, if you hear any noise, it ain't the boys, it's Ladies Night. Come on. And of course, George is singing on top of that.
Good. Ain't nothing but a party, y'all.
Told you, man. Barry Gordy and James Brown rolled up and smoked. Let's cut straight to the end. This is the super memorable part.
Swing down, swing chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, swing chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, swing chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, swing chariot, stop and let me ride.
There's no way YouTube's gonna clear this. Unbelievable. Each of those instruments, if you just isolate them by themselves, they just got their own funk. This album combines everything that came before it, not only musically with influences like James Brown, but also the idea of a collective of musicians like Motown. But instead of looking backwards, it looks forwards. It looks up to the sky, to endless possibilities. And of course, Parliament would go on to release many more albums and hit songs. George Clinton would spin off many other bands like Bootsy's Rubber Band, Parlet, Brides of Funkenstein, all centered around this same group of musicians. And eventually, all these separate entities would be dissolved and they just became known as Parliament Funkadelic, or also the P-Funk All-Stars. The musicians in Parliament and Funkadelic are too numerous for me to name right now. Their influence is absolutely massive. These albums are so good, and yes, if you know anything about the behind the scenes here, they were often taken advantage of, straight up not paid, not given credit. George Clinton really did them dirty. But as hard as that is to grapple with, musically, Parliament made something truly incredible. Let's take a brief look at the biggest hit from this album, Give Up the Funk. This one lists drummer Jerome Braley as one of the writers, and his groove on this song is undeniable. But as he admits, he took the groove for this song from another song, Fame by David Bowie. Now let's isolate just the drums, right? Let's pick up a tempo a little bit. Here we go. Mothership Connection and Parliament in general would go on to have a massive cultural impact, musically and otherwise. The Mothership, the giant UFO that would land on stage during their live performances, it's now in the Smithsonian. This album influenced generations of music that would come after it, not only indirectly through inspiration, like the sound of the bass or the sound of those synths, but also through sampling. Dr. Dre famously sampled the song Mothership Connection for his song Let Me Ride on 1992's The Chronic. Ice Cube, Warren G, Eazy-E, Snoop Dogg all sampled Parliament Funkadelic in some capacity. You can't have G-Funk without P-Funk. And for George Clinton, he's all about hip-hop producers sampling his music. As he said, "I'm hoping that we get back to what it was like in the early days. You know, how it was in the 80s when sampling was alive, before it got all legally tangled and everybody got too scared to do it anymore. These are legal samples in there, backed by ourselves, and everyone's going to get their money. They don't have to be afraid. And more than that, we're intentionally putting them out there, hoping that people will use them and get back to the spirit of making whatever music they want to make today. That's what they're there for." Alright, now it's time to hear from you. Earlier this week on Patreon, I put up a link where you can submit your own story about this album, how it makes you feel, the impact it's had on you, what you've learned. Let's hear from you.
But I will say how I feel, especially about this album, is that it kind of reminds me of my youth, even though today is the first day I might ever heard of it. To give you more context and explain to you what I mean, I'm American, but my parents aren't. They're Haitian immigrants. So when they played music, I was listening to hip hop, jazz, etc., like what my friends were listening to. I was more so listening to Haitian compa, which is a dancehall genre. And even though compa and funk use different instruments and whatnot, I would say they're similar in the sense that they're both designed to make you move and dance and whatnot. So yeah, so this album sort of brings me back to when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, despite the fact I never heard it before, because of the key similarities it has to compa music and stuff.
The next thing we'll be doing is the Campfire livestream later this week with a food and drink pairing. To join for free, sign up at patreon.com/diggingthegreats.